Now on BBC One, more expatriate entrepreneurs talk about living with Uncle Sam as we visit Washington for Whicker's World.
Washington, D.C., capital of the Western world, draws British migrants into a small bureaucratic community totally devoted to the spectator sport of politics. Its social life, despite the diplomatic whirl, is surprisingly restrained. Yet this is a city where sound travels faster than light, helped upon its way by a small blonde from Norfolk with a beguiling telephone manner.
Hello, you've reached the lair of Diana McClellan. I can't catch the phone right now, but I don't want to miss anything you'd like to say. If you'll be kind enough to speak to this little beep, I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you.
She's a gossip columnist who's been at the capital's keyholes for the past 9 years. Her column in the Washington Times is syndicated around the country, and she also spreads what she calls her tantalizing tidbits on television.
10 seconds. Right in the studio.
Diana's here, Diana McClellan, the ear, from the Washington Times and other newspapers. Lots of activity. A new foot disease.
New foot disease.
What is that?
Diplomatic distress. You must watch out for it, Marty. You get it standing around on high heels at diplomatic receptions. Diplomats' wives.
Oh, this is a real disease.
This is a real
It's
disease.
not foot and mouth or anything.
No.
She arrived in Washington in the 50s when her father was air attaché at the British Embassy, and since then has become a wife, mother, grandmother, and a considerable gossip.
They're advised to stand on carpets, to pump hands, do foot exercises beforehand, and behave themselves.
Washington can be surprisingly verdant and stylish. Mrs. McClellan lives in a terraced townhouse that feels quite Fulham. Chelsea, even. The capital may be the power base of the Western world, but it's still a gossipy, villagey sort of place.
It is a very villagey place. It's a terribly small town, and it's kept smaller by the fact that the permanent residents here, the sort of hardcore Washingtonians, are really quite a minority. Everybody else swoops through, so just by being here in this particular town for a long time, you become a fixture. You become as much a part of the landscape as, the capital or the...
Yes.
I
How do
think
they
in England
regard you? I mean, do they think you're the lowest form of journalistic life
Well,
or the
I
most important?
Well, I wouldn't say either one. I think I'm just regarded as something that's there, To some people it's very important. People who are on the hustle or trying to establish themselves, of course, think that getting their name in a gossip column is something that's interesting. They want their friends to know they're important enough to be written about. A lot of people spend a lot of energy trying to keep out of gossip columns.
How do you get your...
Depends on how naughty they are.
How do you get your news? I mean,
The Lord provides. This is a very gossipy town. Washington is a town that runs on the oil of gossip. Everything is gossip, partially because there are so many different segments of Washingtonians. There are the ones on Capitol Hill, White House, embassies, so forth. They really have very little to do with each other. And they feel, I think, when they read a gossip column, that they're getting something of the other part of Washington that they wouldn't be getting in the day-to-day business. And I think that they tend to also, when they read my column and see what is there, to say, oh boy, I've got something that would fit in there. I try to keep the tone of the column light enough so that people don't think, oh boy, is she going to dump on me, or us if we do such and such. I try to keep the informational flow going.
now, you say some quite bitchy things, but you try and do it in a light-hearted way, is that it?
Yes, well, the nastier the thing you have to say, I think the more delicate you have to be about it, and that is because of the business of being in Washington for the long haul. You don't want to get a reputation as a complete cow, because they've come and gone. There've been many Washington gossips. who have finally bitched themselves out of a job. Because sooner or later, no one will talk to them except, you know, sort of creepy people who slink up to you at parties, or people with great axes to grind. Of course, everybody has an axe to grind, but...
And everybody has something to sell. They're usually themselves.
Well, remember, Washington is a city where power and access are the most important products. And they mean money for people. They mean everything. So everybody wants to get at something.
And sex. I mean, sex.
It's not a sexy town at all.
No.
I mean, there is sex, obviously, but sex isn't nearly as important as power and access. When it does rear its charming head, it's few and far between. Believe me, as a topic of gossip.
Now, people are very litigious here. You have to be careful.
I'm very careful. Yeah, never been sued. Jimmy Carter threatened. When he was out of
What
office.
have you written about him?
I'd done that little item that mentioned that when the Reagans were staying in Blair House at the transition time, somehow or other the Carter people happened to know what Nancy Reagan was saying on the phone to her decorator, and they were spreading it around. And I drew a very tentative conclusion from that, which I gather enraged the Carter people. There are certain things I just won't cover because they're so they're slimy, and they make the reader feel slimy too. I don't think readers like to leave a gossip column feeling, ew, I wish I didn't know that. So I try to
Like
avoid...
what? What sort of...
Well, I don't want to sort of drag homosexuals out of the closet and that sort of thing. But if I did, the whole city would be crawling. The streets would be thick with them. So I wouldn't want to do that. I don't want to be the first person to tell a wife that her husband's messing around, you know. I don't want to send people sobbing into their pillows at night.
Politics is a sort of spectator sport here, is it not really? I mean,
absolutely.
people are posturing on stage.
Absolutely. It is the most entrancing spectator sport of all.
And you're helping the men in Lynchburg, Virginia, learn what's happening as soon as the people down the street know about it.
I hope so, yes.
That's
I
what's
believe in
behind
equal
it.
gossip for all.
You see, politicians need journalists the way the royal family need them, do they not?
I think so. I think so. Of course, they'd like to have a lot of control over what
They don't
over
like
what
them, but they
journalists
can't
say.
exist without them.
Yes,
really.
yes.
Journalists are a necessary evil, and gossip writers perhaps are more evil than
more
others.
unnecessary, more evil.
Are journalists popular dinner guests here in this town?
Oh, very much, yes.
You're sought after.
Fairly sought after. Probably not as much as the sort of heavy-hitter columnists. A woman's in a funny position everywhere, of course. And if you're inviting a gossip columnist, everyone presumes that you do want some publicity for the dinner. But all journalists are popular here. For one thing, they can bring gossip to the party itself. They can enliven it with bits and bobs they've picked up on that.
They know all the good stories. So they're popular. I read in your book in spite of their table manners.
So they like people with seniority.
It's a rather prudish town.
Very prudish town. Very prudish town. You have to tiptoe around the edge of all sorts of things here. Yes.
Now, you can get away.
Partially, you can understand why, because remember, a lot of these people are elected from very small towns. You've got people from Oklahoma and Bible Belt places, and imagine the horror of their constituencies when they go back and suddenly everybody there knows, because of the columnists indicated, that they sleep in red heart-shaped water beds, or that they've quietly, shucked a couple of wives during the August recess, and this doesn't go over too well with the folks back home.
Now, power is everything here. Once you've lost it, the public reaction is instant.
There's no question, yes. It's a little bit poignant. A lot of people want to hang around the town and keep going when they're out. Some do. A lot of Democrats stay in town. They tend to stay in town more than Republicans, because Democrats tend not to have as much money as the Republican government appointees. And this is the best time they've ever had, is when they were here in power. So they tend to hang around. The Republicans tend to go home and be even richer.
Yet Kissinger manages to straddle the various...
He's always good at a party, as a matter of fact. I know I say no one's good at a party, but he's a good talker. He's a very funny man, and he was very popular with the press, always. But I remember just about 2 or 3 weeks after the change of administration, when the Carters came in, his going to the barber shop and Milton Pitts, who is the barber to the divine and the presidents and so forth, and being told, well, I'm afraid you're going to have to wait, Mr. Kissinger, we have a VIP here. And of course, it was one of the new guard, and this is an indication of the way things change here.
Now, are people scared of you as a gossip columnist?
Well, I don't think so. I think some are, you know, but I think usually
Well,
they're
the
the ones who haven't been around for very
You
long.
sit here like a black widow spider,
I thought you were
waiting for
going to use
people to telephone you. Or do you go out on your bicycle and...
I do go to parties, as a matter of fact, and the main reason I go to them is not because I think everyone's going to spill the beans right there, but just to re-establish contact with people and convince people that I'm not the black widow spider waiting there.
But
In
you
other words,
sidle
it's
up
another
and
angle.
say, give me the dirt.
Well, no.
Have you
people aren't
divorced
gonna,
anyone
people
lately?
No, people aren't going to give you dirt at parties. People, if they like the cut of your jib, might give you a call the next day. This White House is very, it's very good with the press on the whole, I think. I mean, I know you hear a lot of belly aching from the White House press corps, but they're far more generous to the press, I would say, than ones before. For example, the Carter people always, cut off the press, various members of the press who'd said anything at all from their Christmas party lists, whereas the Reagans have sort of expanded it so that everybody gets a little snuffle at the trough.
That White House trough also provides all the best high-level gossip. And on this stately set, the well-informed White House staffers are prime targets. One of the men behind President Reagan comes from Gravesend in Kent. The accent of Dr. Geoffrey Kemp has puzzled many of those he meets officially, including Mrs. Thatcher when he accompanied Secretary of State Schultz to Chequers. He's the only ex-Brit who's a senior member of the White House staff.
Well, I'm the Senior Director for the Near East and South Asia on the National Security Council and a Special Assistant to the President. And this means that my turf, if you like, stretches from Marrakesh to Bangladesh. It contains all the trouble spots of the world, or I think most of them, and keeps one very busy.
It is a surprise to find an Englishman at the heart of government here. I mean, it would be unthinkable that Mrs. Thatcher's closest advisor on the Middle East should be an American. Even an American who came to London in 1967.
Yes, I think that's right. I think it would be unheard of also in France, Germany, Italy, Japan, certainly any of the other democracies except the United States, which is what's unique about this country.
Does anyone ever comment on the fact that of your English origin and your English accent, on which you retain a slight grasp still?
Oh yes. In fact, you're more noticeable, I think, in the U.S. government with a British accent than if you have a strongly guttural East European accent.
Dr. Kissinger.
Right, that's considered normal, but there is something rather bizarre, I think, about an English accent, in the government.
Now, Americans do tend, in general, rather to romanticize Britain, do they not?
Yes, very much so. I don't think they do in Washington, which is a very sophisticated city, but certainly in other parts of the country, it's assumed, on the one hand, that if you come from England, that you have a lineage that goes back to Henry VIII, if not earlier, and that it's codified in estates and Savile Row close. And for that reason, there's a certain bewilderment on some people's parts as to why anyone would want to leave the idyllic, romanticized Britain, which so many Americans see and want to see.
Is this a convivial place in which to live?
Oh, Washington is, yes, extremely.
You're excluding the rest of America?
No. I think that there's such diversity in this country that you can't generalize about the United States. That there are obviously problems. The problems are very obvious. They stand out like warts. But the great thing about the United States is that the problems are addressed openly on the front page of the newspapers. Everyone talks about them. There's no attempt to disguise or hide what's going on.
Are we talking about violence, crime, color, that sort of thing?
All the things that are read about so avidly in Europe, yes.
One avid reader of all things American is Professor of American History at the George Washington University. and he happens to be an Englishman who arrived here from the universities of Manchester and Sussex. Professor Marcus Faulkner Cunliffe has judiciously balanced this disadvantage of birth by marrying 3 Americans, and says as a lecturer he now has the spurious authority of the man from Mars. I wondered whether this meant that, as an imported English academic, he now felt slightly overvalued.
Well, I mustn't let anyone hear this, but...
Since it's just the two of us.
Yes, yes, I suppose slightly, but then I feel there's some law of compensation here, because I can believe that I was undervalued for a large part of my life.
Now, what about the level of, the intellectual level of your students? How do they compare? You were at Manchester University, you were at Sussex University. How do they compare with George Washington?
I suppose you must have heard this kind of answer before. It's a common one, but I think although it's a truism, it's generally true that British students write better than Americans, but don't talk as well. The students that I have at George Washington University here are also rather more miscellaneous. Some of them work in government jobs. There are, I think, more people in this country than in Britain who take courses after work or after retirement. The Open University, I know, has made a big difference, and Sussex itself used to set great emphasis on trying to have so-called mature students. But, for example, in a class at the moment of, say, 30 people, I have a retired Army colonel, I have a woman who's probably 60, who is a teacher in California, who's just here for the year, and at the other extreme, people of 19 or 20.
Is there a greater sense of urgency here? They feel they've got to
learn.
Yes,
I think
whereas,
so.
In England they can skive off and go to the cinema.
Yes, that is so. They are very well aware, of course, that it costs to have an education.
Here.
Quite a lot of them are working part-time.
Yes. This business of being a soda jerk to pay for your
yes,
university education is still
does obtain, yes.
Whereas in England it's freebies.
Yes, pretty much. And of course, even if you're pretty well-to-do nowadays in America as a parent, and you can afford these huge fees at the prestigious private universities like Harvard and Yale, it's still going to cost you an awful lot. So even it would have to be a millionaire to make no comment to his children about the cost of a 4-year BA degree. So I think there is a feeling here that they've got to get their money's worth, which means, among other things, that they're going to keep you at work. They're going to ring you up, they're going to come and see you in office hours. They're going to put their hands up and say, what do you mean by that? And it's very good for you to have that sort of challenge.
Now, I've been told many times since I've been over here about the general level of education here. I mean, the curator of a zoo is telling me that the signs had to be designed for third-grade students, for 13-year-olds to read. And an ecologist said not 13-year-olds, 8-year-olds,
yes,
9-year-olds.
Yes.
Is that a fair comment or is that cruel?
Yes, it's half a fair comment. I think there is a level of ignorance, which is probably the result of the educators as much as anything in this country. The babying of children, not pushing children enough, not expecting them to read. Oh, these planes. And alas, perhaps the very profession that you've helped to make glorious may account. I don't know how many hours a week the average American child or teenager spends looking at television, but I think it does have a rather bad effect. There are fewer good bookstores here per capita than you'll find in Europe. Reading as a habit seems to be less widespread, and then that would naturally tend to reflect...
Television is abysmal.
Generally, yes, awful. Yes, awful.
Apart from the BBC.
Apart from the BBC and or ITV, I hope you'll allow them the word. And this, of course, is yet another of these comical ways in which Britain tends to be nicely overvalued. People will sometimes speak to me of masterpiece theatre, as they call it here, as if I had personally invented it or contributed.
Now, on a personal note, Professor, you've rather persisted in marrying American women all the time, I note. And they're perhaps, one might say in general, a little more strident than English women.
Well, if they are, I'm in good company, of course, because Harold Macmillan and Winston Churchill and Tony Benn and all kinds of people have had American wives or American mothers or whatever. I think it's an Anglo-American tendency, and it does seem to me that for whatever reasons, quirks, if you want to call them that, a great number of people in the British Isles, males, have found happiness, variety with American women. They found somebody who has a certain boldness, strength of vision, and of course we know that when the big wave of American women started coming to England in the late 19th century, quite a high proportion of them did marry into British families, rather more than the other way round, I think. I realise I haven't answered the question altogether, but stridency is a feature of certain voices, I suppose, in this country, and there can be something very depressing about hearing a large group of, say, Middle Westerners sometimes greeting one another.
Is there anything in common between the Brits who come out here and drop anchor? Do you detect? What's the psychology of this sort of migration?
Yes.
Are you adventurers?
It's a fair spectrum, obviously, yes.
Acquisitive?
Yes. Well, it's people who obviously are able or willing to pull up stakes, and they may, of course, have very good motives for doing this, or they may have slightly dubious ones. They may feel they made a mess of things in one place and go to another. May even be criminals, which I think has long been a supply for this country.
Botany Bay.
Yes, that's right. And people who beat it just one step ahead of the police. It would be nice to think that there is more of an element of enterprise. I think so. I think there must be a proportion of people who are a bit malcontent, going back to Tom Paine, the time of the American Revolution, who had had a couple of failed businesses and marriages in England, and then comes over here and writes his blasts against the royal family and the British connection and so on. And then later in his life, of course, starts writing blasts against the Americans too. That is a personality type.
There's something about betterment, isn't there? I mean, you will certainly have bettered yourself, will you not, Professor, by coming here? I'm sure your stipend is much greater here than it was at Sussex.
Yes. That was not my prime reason for coming, but I would be a hypocrite if I didn't pretend that it must count for people. All immigrants, obviously, part of their reason to come is to feel that they'll be better off. And the better offness is often material. It doesn't have to be that entirely. And America then becomes, for many of them, a curious mixture, I think, of the place where you made it, so to speak. And that very phrase, I think, is interesting. On the make, making it means, of course, making money, apart from anything else, but it also then means succeeding, being able to do things you couldn't do in some other place. So the degree of freedom and the degree of income, of the cash nexus, are all mixed up together.
Now, your cash nexus, is that going to come into use when you decide to retire and go back to Arundel?
That's a nice point, of course, for all people who come to this country from Britain to think about where are you going to lay your bones and what are the motives about it.
And?
I think as you get older, there are conflicting elements, aren't there? You do become more disinclined to travel, to rack your bones on aircraft and so on, but you also do feel a stronger and stronger return to childhood in a way. You wake up and something reminds you of something way back, and so this can almost in a way be a condition of exile, to be in another country, and yet it sharpens your awareness of where you come from. To that degree it can be pleasurable and valuable. I think writers have often noted that when they're living abroad that they write better, more vividly, in a way with more anguish about the place they came from. James Joyce, of course, is in Trieste, and he thinks about Dublin the whole time.
Yes, Henry James.
Henry James, yes.
When you go back, what do you miss from America?
Well, I miss sunlight, obviously. I miss places staying open at night a lot. Now that I'm used to a certain polyglot quality in America, I think I miss a sense of the variety of people. I miss black people in the large numbers in which you encounter them in Washington, D.C., where 70% of the population is black, and the idioms of terms of that sort. I love going into places at 2 o'clock in the morning, and there's a sort of American openness in that degree, isn't there?
Yes,
if you're in,
marvelous.
let's say, if you're in Edinburgh on a wet Sunday and you want to do something, you can find it. But you wish that John Knox hadn't been quite so successful in closing the place down.
Yes,
It's never quite opened up again as much as you'd like it to.
The ease of living. Now, what about violence, you see?
Violence is a big negative for me. I've personally not suffered anything at all in that 4 years here, but I do know a number of people who have been mugged, held up. I'd say almost half the people I know would have some personal story of their house being, as they say here, burglarized, being burgled or being held up. One woman I know who's raped and the house robbed. The police did eventually arrest somebody for that, but it is always, I think, a little edge of uncertainty. And I also dislike very much an American response to this, which is to have far too many guns around. I think the thing has escalated. It's got out of all sense here, and it's now so much part of the commerce of gun sales
that sort of insecurity affects the quality of your life here tremendously, doesn't it?
Well, somewhat, yes.
It's always at the back of one's mind,
It means you have to be street conscious. You have to just be a little bit aware of what you're doing, where you're going. I go out for a walk in my neighborhood with a dog in the evening to exercise him, and I have no fear about that, but I take my wristwatch and my wallet off just to sort of, and take a stick with me as somehow a matter of course. That may be unnecessary, but With
a dog? You'd think a dog would be...
Well, you should see him, he's rather...
Oh, he's not aggressive?
No, he's not the Doberman Pinscher.
A short, safe walk for an unaggressive dog through the capital's graceful streets, under the protective eye of the Washington police, leads to the Department of State, a clinical monolith that seems a long way from the Victorian curlicues of the Foreign Office. It's like arriving at an airport terminal or some vast, well-guarded conference centre. American foreign policy has been reaching the world with a distinct British accent, for the State Department spokesman is Welsh, from Neath. After a career as foreign correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor, he edited that paper and was then made director of the government radio service in Washington, The Voice of America. He now stars here.
Oh, that's normal. Thanks.
Yeah, boys? They want pictures?
Not a television studio about to go on air, but just another regular Washington briefing.
I'm at the State Department and we're doing a briefing.
The daily midday conference is attended by correspondents from all over the world. It's given by that former Welshman, John Hughes, Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs, in what at first sounds more Bostonian than Glamorgan.
Good morning. I've got a housekeeping announcement and then a statement on developments in the Philippines. Firstly, Secretary Schultz will represent the United States at the 14th General Assembly of the Organization of American States. That will be held in Brasilia, Brazil this year.
John Hughes was once a reporter on a suburban news agency in London and afterwards worked for Reuters and the Daily Mirror. So he knows about crafty questions.
I hear you, but I think to compare El Salvador with the Philippines is not a very realistic kind of comparison.
On human rights and aid, it's not the same.
I don't think it's a realistic comparison.
Does anyone ever comment on the fact that the State Department spokesman seems to have a noticeable British accent?
Yes, I think they do. Not only do we do that daily briefing for the press, but that those words get piped throughout the building on an intercom system and to some other buildings in Washington, other government agencies. And yes, I think for a while people were a little startled.
And you're on television, aren't you?
And on some days, if the news is such and if what you say is meaningful, you're on television.
What made you become a citizen? Why did you do that?
I think that I had decided to make my life in the United States. I warmed to the society. I had married an American girl. Both my children were born in the United States and are Americans. So it seemed to me perhaps the logical and proper thing to be a citizen of the country that had been very good to you.
You were the editor of the Christian Science Monitor, which is the most significant paper here. You were director of the Voice of America. Now you're the spokesman of the State Department. Do you think, had you stayed in Britain, you might have edited the Daily Telegraph, run the BBC World Service, and been a Foreign Office spokesman?
Not simultaneously.
Without wishing to be unkind, is it possible that it's easier to climb the ladder here in the States?
It may be. I think this is a society that opens its arms to people from all around the world. And I suppose the interesting thing is that I have done the equivalent, not being a native-born American. And I think that's one of the refreshing things about American society, that it embraces everybody. Its tradition has been to embrace people from all parts of the world, irrespective of background and race, where they come from. And that, of course, I think has contributed to the strength of the United States. It takes people from all kinds of places with all kinds of talents and abilities. And it's the kind of society, I think, that rewards effort and industry and talent from wherever it comes. There's no prejudice.
See, I'm deeply impressed and jealous because we were both foreign correspondents. Now I'm still carrying my spear, and you're running the nation right here.
Well, but I suspect you have more fun.
I doubt it. You seem to enjoy this job.
Well, I do enjoy it, and it is fun, particularly on a good day. And we also note that President Marcos has called for the immediate trial by a civilian tribunal of all parties who may be held responsible in the two reports. He has also authorized the Agrava board members and the Commission's legal staff to assist in the prosecution of the case. The United States trusts that, as President Marcos has promised, those responsible for Senator Aquino's murder, no matter who they may be, will be held accountable for their crime.
Now, do you get any hassles there? Because if you put a phrase wrong, it has been flashed around the world, and you have committed the United States to whatever it may be.
Well, I think you have to be careful. If you're a spokesman for the foreign policy of a government in the kind of environment in which we're operating here, you're actually talking to several audiences. You're talking to those television cameras at your briefing, and the television networks are looking for 10 seconds, 15 seconds of colorful quote for the evening news.
One snappy phrase.
One snappy phrase. You are also, at the same time, talking to what we in the United States call the wire services, the news agencies, Reuters, AP, UPI, who are looking for a 200-word short, snappy story to move on the wires. You are also talking to the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Christian Science Monitor and the Wall Street Journal, who are going to write longer, more thoughtful pieces about foreign policy. You're also talking to governments. And that, I shouldn't have been surprised, but that did come as something of a surprise to me. Shortly after I started this job, I was at some reception, and the ambassador of a particular country said, Mr. Hughes, good evening. I want you to know that every day I send back to my government every word you say about my particular country. And that makes you careful. Your phrasing does have to be careful. There are certain key words, there are certain key phrases, and if you get them wrong, you conceivably could be shifting foreign policy or certainly causing problems. So you have to be careful.
Now, in Washington, the press is more significant, more important than it is in London, I would suggest. One feels that there are plenty of big-name correspondents here who have the ear of the president even, I suppose. Very few correspondents have the ear of the Prime Minister in England. Do you sometimes feel you are being sidetracked, that people are going behind your back and getting it straight from the Vice President's mouth?
Oh, I think a good reporter will work every channel he possibly can, and so sure, government is large in Washington. There are many agencies, and good correspondent is all over the place, testing, getting a snippet of information here, testing it against another source, collecting another bit here, and finally putting it all together. My own feeling is that it is good for the press to be skeptical of government and to test what any government official or cabinet officer tells them. What concerns me is when a reporter or when a news organization is totally cynical about government. I think when skepticism becomes cynicism, that's very bad. That is not a constructive development in our society, in any country.
It's always believed, of course, that skepticism and cynicism apart, that the press here has much more power than it does back in England.
Well, I think the press is very influential in the United States. There's no question of that. Some people call it an additional branch of government.
And individual journalists more powerful?
I think that the role of the columnist, the political columnist, is probably more prestigious than the role of the columnist in Britain. I don't say that in any derogatory way about British journalism, but I think it's fair to say that a major columnist on a reputable newspaper will certainly be read by the President and by the Secretary of State and by other cabinet ministers. Doesn't mean he necessarily moves the President, but the view will certainly be taken note of.
The voice is heard.
The voice is heard.
Now, you were saying that you thought I might have more fun. Do you ever have regrets that you've become a gamekeeper?
No. I never expected to serve in the government. It came as a surprise, and I have enjoyed. I've had 3 jobs in a little over 3 years. I've enjoyed each of them, and I like this one very much indeed. It is fascinating to be, especially if you've been a journalist, to be at the center of the foreign policy operation for a while. I don't suggest it's a career for everybody.
Now, there's nothing drawing you back to the valleys, is there? Drawing you back to Wales?
One never, as President Reagan says, one never says never, but I'd love to go back to Britain, but I certainly don't have any plans to live in Britain again. My family's here, and in the way of things, I suspect that...
And when you leave this significant desk and this significant office and retire, what do you do?
Well, our heart is in a place called Cape Cod, which is a rather pleasant peninsula.
A democratic area, of course.
Well, oh no, I wouldn't say that. There is a sturdy independence about the good folk of Cape Cod, which tends not to leave them typecast on either the Democratic or the Republican side. But I would expect to go back to Cape Cod when I finish in government.
And?
Well, we own some newspapers up there, some small newspapers, and I would expect to grow old gracefully on Cape Cod, running my newspapers and maybe doing some writing.
Back to poaching again?
Back to paradise.
Working conditions in this Washington office must seem like paradise to the son of a Yorkshire engine driver who's taken over as editorial director of the national magazine with a $2 million sale published from this $200 million headquarters. When I arrived, he'd only been in command a week and had no office, but freed from the restrictive practices which still prevent the use of modern technology in Fleet Street, had established himself in a corridor cubbyhole and was facing up to his newfound computers with all the assurance of an ex-editor of the Times, Harry Evans.
So what are you doing, Harry? What's coming out?
Well, this is I have 2 computers in this office, and of course in England I wouldn't be allowed to have a single one, or even to do this. This would be an act which would bring the whole of the British printing industry to a stop if I did it in London. But here, everybody's delighted, because this is my personal computer in which I do memoranda, store comments and letters, and shortly they'll be fixing a jack in there so I can send memos directly to Boston and New York to my officers there, the book company and the chairman of the company. And they'll be able to write to me, and we'll be able to amend the balance sheets and whatever it may be. That's what I do on this personal computer, but I have another computer over here, which is where I can watch what's going on in US News and World Report. For instance, if I press this, I can read the story, does Mondale have a chance? Or press this, insurance companies cannot base their car insurance rates on sex. Sounds an interesting story, but let's go to the next one. And so on, and so on. I can go through the whole of what's being readied for US News here. And if I want to, with the right commands, I can change their stories and send them back to the desk. So I've got a picture here of what's going on throughout the entire editorial operations of US News, and then here I've got my little office, which is a kind of like a secretary that doesn't answer back, you know.
And doesn't make the coffee.
And doesn't make the coffee.
But this is the very technology that you were trying to introduce into the Times.
Yes, exactly.
And what you lost.
Well, this is what's exhilarating here. In 1976, I came to the United States for Times newspapers, went to Detroit, where they had a primitive version of this stuff. And we installed it at Times newspapers in '76, and as everybody knows, or ought to know, it's never been used effectively. It's used in a very primitive manner at Times newspapers. No journalist can touch this, and nowhere in Britain. And various members of the printing unions can touch this, but there's a lot of duplication and a lot of unnecessary waste in the way it's used in Britain, and it's tragic, really. See, with this machine also and this, I can call up the library clips on Whicker. Whicker, age 33, whatever it may be, and find out all I need to know about you, provided we have it in our library. Now, journalists shouldn't be denied that kind of access, and it's absolutely fantastic to work here and do that. I can, of course, if I want to, I can print out on here onto my machine there.
See, it's not only in America that you can do this. You can do this all around the world, except in England.
Well, you can do it in darkest Africa and brownest Middle East, and you can do it in Kuwait, anywhere except Britain. Britain is the most backward country in the world in terms of journalistic access, or anybody else's access in the printing industry, to these wonderful gadgets. Of course, at the end of the day, as many of my colleagues would say, including you, I suspect, having a toy like this doesn't necessarily improve the journalism or the writing. You still have to have curiosity and persistence. You still have to have the good reporter. And on this magazine, which I'm, you know, looking after editorially, I have to think about the quality of the journalism as well as the hardware.
Yes, I mean, you're getting seduced, aren't you? I've been watching you this morning.
Yes,
you're seduced too, because it is a new toy, isn't it?
That's right. Exactly. Well, I wrote my book, Good Times, Bad Times, on one of these in my electronic cottage in Kent.
Did you?
Yes, that's where I got hooked on it.
What about staff? I mean, your reporters, the calibre of your reporters may be good or bad. Secretaries?
Well, when you come to the United States, you have to realise, first of all, that secretaries are not the same beasts as they are in London. I got a shock on my first day as a book publisher in New York when I hired a temporary secretary. Charming girl, couldn't take shorthand, hardly anybody can, enormously slow, and so on, but I couldn't operate like that, so I asked for a new temporary secretary. Next girl similarly couldn't do it. She was very sweet, marvellous telephone answering manner, may I say. Good morning, Mr. Whicker. Mr. Evans is not in, but he will return your call. Superb. So I tried the next day to get somebody, and in the middle of the day I said, get us a copy of US News and Time magazine, would you? She said, no. I said, they're out. She said, yes. I said, well, what's the trouble? She said, it's not in my schedule of work category. It's not in my task to define for me. And when you hire somebody in the States, you have to be careful. With certain sensitive areas, you don't ask secretaries to do things which they think messengers should do. Now, it's not as bad as London may be, with the heavy union restrictions about who does what, but that was a shock to me. So on the 5th day, I finally ended up, I said, get me a good secretary, I don't care what, and I want somebody who will do anything. Girl turned up. I said, you've got a strange accent. Yes, I'm from London, she said. And this is ridiculous.
Now, I mean, this is gracious living, isn't it? I've never seen such an office as this.
No,
Those carpets and the statues and the lighting and the pictures and the hush.
carpets and air conditioning and coffee stations and machines. And
I mean, somebody was suggesting to me that they were going to use Muzak, and they were going to have Muzak of typewriters and people shouting, hold the front page.
It is strange. In fact, the magazine is produced by stealth, as it were. It's all, these electronic snakes are winding their way through the building, which you can hardly see, except unless you do something like this. And then the magazine, it's suddenly, and it's quiet and peaceful here.
It's unnerving, actually,
It is
isn't
unnerving.
it?
I sometimes think that if they screwed the light pine wood down, I'd wake up and find I was in my coffin.
Now, how does an American office take to a limey coming in as a numero uno? I mean, you're editorial director, you're
Yes.
the ultimate hire and fire man
Yes,
here.
yeah. Well, they take a certain amount of suspicion. What do you know, anyway? And
what do you tell them?
Well, the best thing is not to say anything, just to try and, as you work your way into the editorial operation, show them that you have been around before and that there's no difference at the end of the day between the nature of journalism. Now, some people would dispute that. There's certainly a difference in the American sensibility. On a very serious and important magazine like this, I'm going to go exceedingly slowly.
Of course, after you've been editor of the Times, there's nowhere else to go, is there, journalistically?
Well, after editing the Times, you can come to the United States, but there's nothing else you can do in Britain, perhaps.
No.
And that's one of the reasons I'm here.
See, our craft there's a lot of camaraderie in it, isn't there?
Yes.
I mean, with a lot of friendship. Here, there's no Alvinos. They're very ruthless, and one feels that they're a bit short on friendship.
That may be true, because the competition and is tremendous. However, there's one big difference. They have no Alvinos, but they have a much more serious attitude to journalism. I mean, professional matters are discussed in a way which in Britain would be regarded as you're being rather pompous, old boy, you know, and there's none of the Fleet Street cynicism here about endless discussions about the propriety of invading privacy or government and all that kind of thing. Of course, it's a much more open society, and the press, perhaps, being taken much more seriously here, not necessarily for the right reasons, takes itself much more seriously than we do. And there's very little of the entertainment or pop press here. If I wanted to, I could call up the Secretary of State and he would immediately be available in a way in Britain where you have to cut through a swathe of private secretaries and offices. So since journalism is easier to practice here, since it's regarded more seriously, journalists take themselves more seriously.
What about money? I mean, you must be earning an enormous amount now.
Since one doesn't bother to count, but the inland revenue here is quite as efficient as the British inland revenue. Yes, I am well paid, very well paid indeed.
The salary scale are totally different.
If I translate it into pounds, I don't think I would dare go out in the streets to feel somebody would rob me. One is well paid, it's expensive, but the amount of disposable income is much higher.
Then again, Mrs. Evans is also earning a quid or two.
Yes, Tina Brown, editing Vanity Fair. She's earning quite well, too. But one isn't here just to make money, really, although it's quite useful to be able to pay one's creditors.
Could it be that this is a place in which to make money, but not a place in which to live?
There are many seductive aspects of life in America because the playgrounds are accessible. I always said, when I first came here in 1956 and lived in New York for a time, I always said, New York must be the worst place in the world to live unless you can insulate yourself from some of the pressures by dollar bills. And it's a marvel. I have a house on Long Island on the beach, which I go to. It takes me 2 hours on one of those wonderful American trains, hooting with the lights going and somebody serving you drinks in it and so on. So it's very delightful if you're well off, and it's not all that hard to be well off as a professional or middle-class person here. You can live a very good life indeed, a far better and more comfortable life than Britain. I feel angry and proud about Britain, both ways at the same time, because although one can do these things, there are many aspects of British life which I miss. I miss the politeness, I miss the tranquility, But nobody here cares about Britain or thinks about Britain. It's a very great shock arriving here and turning to the paper, and after a week you realise you haven't read a single story about Britain. Nothing has happened in Britain that week. And if you go across the United States, you may go months and months without finding a single story about Britain, except woman of 78 fails driving test in Britain, or passes driving test, or a woman of 78 drives 100 miles an hour. They're into the kind of stories about Britain that the Daily Express used to do about America. You know, Americans are people who eat plastic flowers. That kind of paragraph would appear in the Express in the 50s and 60s. And we're relegated to that kind of curiosity. They're quite interested in Lady Di and the Queen, quite interested in Mrs. Thatcher's when she's brave and stands up. But you get a lot of distortions occasionally which anger me about the IRA, which is treated as isn't treated in the way it ought to be treated.
I mean, it's given equal time.
Well, on NBC television, they give equal time to the IRA spokesman or to the NORAD spokesman after the Brighton bombing. Well, that is an obscenity. So, and America is very interested. They're not really interested. It's not just Britain. They're not interested really in Europe at all. And as the leaders they are of the free world, I find this rather discommoding, and I hope I can do something about it as a journalist here.
What about the calibre of people here? The calibre of the people who are working on this magazine compared to the people you had on the Times?
Well, they're very, very enormously capable. They've come from a diversity of cultures, which is one element where they are stronger than the great intellects and extremely well-educated people on the Times and Sunday Times. Here, coming from all parts of the world and all parts of this country, there's a diversity of culture which is a strength.
These things usually don't hit the desk until late Thursday or early Friday anyway, so that's why there's not much going on up there.
And what are we editing here? Are you editing on the Tube now?
Yes, I'm editing the editorial written by Mr. Stone.
He's entered it, has it? It's entered it. You're correcting it or cutting
Correct,
it?
correcting the spelling and the styling and the punctuation.
Yeah. Did you ever work? Let's not forget it that the civilization here was basically an Anglo-Saxon one when it was started. They've made many differences with the written constitution, but respect for the rule of law, regard for civil liberties, in many ways, they've gone further than we have, because we have no written constitution. Personal rights are more greatly protected in many ways in the United States than they are in Britain, where it's ad hoc. It depends, as I say, England's all improvisation. Depends on what judges on the bench on a particular day, whether the press is free or less free. Here, there's always coming up against the Constitution, which is written down. The difference between Britain and America in business and many other ways, in my judgment, is that Americans construct superb programs and people operate them. Britain operates on individuality and much more quirky and eccentric. In the United States, I think there are three layers. There's a great layer at the bottom of young women who do perfect work in banks and publishing houses, provided you press the right button, and they'd work like clockwork then, you know? But if you ask something slightly out of the ordinary, the machine goes on, blink, 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 blink. No, that is a problem, that is a problem, that is a problem. And so you then have to go to the next layer, where you've got another layer of women, very important United States women. They've had greater advancement and opportunity than in Britain, which is very exciting, where you get a superbly groomed woman of about 33 who has been trained to deal with the problems which the robotic layer hasn't been able to. Then you get an extreme well. Of course, at the top there's this thin cream of men getting into their stretch limos.
Chaps in waistcoats?
Well, I don't go in stretch limos, and a waistcoat is a gesture to you today.